Okay, anyway, I'll start the lecture. So essentially, uh, today's topic is on hepatitis and fulminant hepatic failure. The competencies to be achieved in this particular lecture are about knowing about the individual viruses and knowing about the prevention, contamination, and how each one spreads, what are the various vaccines that are available, and then to discuss about the fulminant hepatic failure. So acute hepatitis, as you know, it is an inflammatory disease of the liver which can be caused by infectious and non-infectious etiologies. The condition is more often than not self-limiting, but can progress to acute liver failure or to chronic liver disease. Hepatitis A and E, they are spread by fecal-oral route through consumption of contaminated water or food. In children, the hepatitis A is more common, while hepatitis E more is predominantly a disease of the elder age group. Hepatitis B and C are spread through parenteral route, which is the exposure through infected blood or body fluids. And obviously, the vertical transmission is an important component of the hepatitis B and C transmission. The other etiologies include infectious, which are viral. The hepatotrophic viruses predominantly, that is 90%, include hepatitis A, B, C, and D. Hepatitis A, as we discussed, is more in kids, and hepatitis E more in young adults. Hepatitis B and C are more prevalent in high-risk individuals, and they are the ones which have a tendency to evolve into chronic disease processes. There are other viruses like CMV, Epstein-Barr, and dengue viruses, which are also hepatotrophic, and each one has got unique characteristics. For example, dengue has got a possibility of having anecteric hepatitis, while the hepatitis viruses per se, they have got tender hepatomegaly. So each particular hepatotrophic virus has got a unique nature of illness. Then there are other bacterial and parasitic illnesses. Drug-induced hepatitis, as you can see, there is a huge list, and which can be dose-dependent for the drugs which are metabolized through the liver, like isoniazid, sodium valproate, acetaminophen, or there can be idiosyncratic reactions. There are various metabolic and genetic causes like Wilson's, galactosemia, alpha-1 antitrypsin, etc. And obviously, there's autoimmune hepatitis. The pathophysiology of acute hepatitis. This is essentially that the hepatotrophic viruses, they start the cascade which leads to the necrosis of cells and the apoptosis of hepatocytes. During the acute hepatitis B, the HLA-DR on the hepatocyte membrane is activated and the significant apoptosis is observed. The inflammatory cell infiltration of the acini and the portal side of the portal tracts is also observed. As you also remember from your pathology, there are conditions which of hepatitis which cause a central lobular necrosis. This is particularly important because this acini zone 3 is quite distant to the efferent blood flow. Henceforth, in areas which are prone to ischemia and the metabolic toxins, they cause a lot of central lobular necrosis. Also, it is important to know that in these particular in hepatitis, there is a presence of astrophil bodies or Consilman bodies. They are essentially small shrunken eosinophilic structures which lack the nucleus, which are left behind after the apoptosis has taken place. These are some pathognomic features which give us an idea that the patient has got hepatitis. If and when a significant proportion of the hepatocytes are involved, that is when the patient starts manifesting with features of acute liver cell failure. Going on, I'm sorry this slide is a bit crowded, but this is just to elaborate that the prodromal phase, which is like, because most of the viruses, they behave like a bowel illness. So there is a prodromal phase which consists of a non-specific flu-like illness, which will have anorexia, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, fatigue, fever. What is important to understand is that the jaundice normally is occurs 1 to 2 weeks after the onset of prodrome. So by that time, especially in the context of settings of nurseries or daycare settings, when or crashes, in those kind of settings, when the first child starts to have icteric hepatitis, by that time 2 weeks would have already elapsed and many more patients would have already been exposed to the same source before the first index case is detected. So this is particularly important. What is also important is that this is unlike the non-viral hepatitis, in which cases like in enteric fever, leptospirosis, there is in most of the viral illnesses, the prodrome of fever usually subsides by the time the jaundice appears. While in bacterial infections like enteric fever, there is normally febrile icterus. So when the icterus is there, the patient has got temperature also. This is a very important feature and should be a part of your clinical history. What is also important is that that is as far as the clinical examination goes. As far as the physical findings are concerned, the then we go on to how much hepatomegaly is there, whether it is tender or not, whether there is concomitant splenomegaly, and whether there is cholestasis. So cholestasis manifests as jaundice, dark urine, acolic stools. And it is important that as the patient has acute liver cell failure signs, the patient will have worsening icterus, alteration of sensorium, basically encephalopathy, bleeding manifestations because of underlying coagulopathy. And unfortunately, these patients, because of the liver cell failure, have got concomitant compromised glucose homeostasis. They have got impaired synthesis of coagulation factors, and they are very prone to secondary infections, be it bacterial or fungus, and that leads to precipitation of the encephalopathy thereof. Going on, so we will briefly discuss the most common kinds of hepatitis. Hepatitis A, the median incubation periods, which is essentially the time from exposure to the onset of symptoms, is around a month. That is 4 weeks, 28 days, and the peak infectivity usually occurs after the second week. Sorry, during the second week. And as we have discussed, this is particularly important in a childcare settings. Also, it is important to understand that HIV tends to be more severe in the older age groups as compared to the younger kids. Acute liver failure in HIV is quite rare and occurs in only less than 1% of the patients. Hepatitis B, this the course is slightly variable, and especially this has decreased after the universal hepatitis B vaccination has started. The incubation period ranges from 45 to 160 days with a mean of 100 days. The risk of developing chronic infection of carrier state, which is essentially defined as persistent of hepatitis B surface antigen in the blood for more than 6 months, it is dependent upon what is the mode of acquisition. Like vertical transmission is more, and it's more common, depends upon the age and depends upon the immune function of the patient. Chronic hepatitis B infection, it occurs in more than 90% of the infants that are affected perennially. Among children who are infected less than 5 years of age, around one-fourth to half, they go on to develop chronic hepatitis B. HCV, blood and blood products are the most common source, and as is MTCD, that is mother to child transmission. And again, it is important to know that post transfusion hepatitis C infection, the incubation period is quite long, up to 8 weeks, and the acute anecdotic phase is also quite common in these patients. Only 1/3 of these hepatitis C afflicted patients, they go on to have icterus and symptoms. Hepatitis D virus, which we have not discussed in this, and as you know, it is because of superinfection of hepatitis B carrier with HDV. Of this, unfortunately, when they both are concomitantly there, then 80% will go on to develop a chronic hepatitis B, HDV hepatitis, which will end up having cirrhosis, while around 1/10 will end up having an acute severe disease, which will then recover. Hepatitis E, on the other hand, it causes a self-limiting illness which lasts a few weeks. It has an incubation period of between 2 weeks to 8 weeks, and this unfortunately afflicts elders more, and the prognosis is quite, it becomes abysmal, specifically when hepatitis B affects pregnant women. So we all know that pregnant women with hepatitis has a bad prognosis, but what happens to the kid? So hepatitis E afflicted pregnant women, they have a lot of premature deliveries, and the infant mortality in those deliveries, they approach 1/3 going on. So how do we evaluate? Just going on. You guys can hear me, right? Okay. I would
Good
request,
afternoon,
because
sir.
from my side, hello.
Yes, sir. It seems that you are audible to only a few people. Could you check your audio settings, whether you have
From
switched
my
on your
side,
audio?
from my side, the audio is being broadcasted to all.
Sir, to the entire audience, or
Yeah, it shows that it shows that it is being broadcasted to all, as is the screen. So I would request that you guys please check in your respective computers. There is a possibility that there might be a setting issue with there, because there should be no reason why you guys were able to listen to me yesterday and not able to listen today, because the settings have not changed at all. So I would request you guys to have a look at your individual um, audio settings.
okay,
So
sir,
I
I'll
shall go
pass on
on.
that message.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir, but
See, because
only a few
because
people
when we are
can
able
hear
to
you.
converse, so because when we are able to converse, obviously my audio is going through, isn't it?
Yes, sir, but like maybe your audio is audible to like only a few people, like not to.
There is no
I'm not sure,
setting
sir.
like that. Okay, so
Okay,
I
sir.
will. Okay, so I'm resuming the lecture. Going on, so I would request everybody to check their settings at their local level, because there is nothing which is stopping from my audio reaching you. There might be a local setting issue. Fine. So I would recommend stop and restart at your end. Going ahead. So for the liver functions we were discussing. So first of all, there are those tests which are affecting hepatocellular necrosis. These include the LFT, serum ammonia. The LFT consists of the AST, that is the aspartate aminotransferase, and the ALT. Serum, it is important to understand that AST can have some extra hepatic sources also. So whenever we see an AST ALT ratio which is abnormal and which is high, it is always important to see whether it is coming from any other extraneous sources. In which case, having a concomitant GGT is also important. Then it is important, other things to see is, because we know the liver doesn't only have a synthetic function, it has got excretory functions as well. So those tests which are affecting cholestasis, like total bilirubin, the direct bilirubin, are also they need to be done. Similarly, the enzyme levels, which can reflect a status of cholestasis, like the serum GGT, which is there in the hepatocytes and the biliary epithelial cells, and the serum ALP are important. Then we go on to tests which reflect liver failure, like prothrombin time, AG ratio, that is albumin globulin ratio. And also it's important to know, in the body there is a lot of crosstalk happening. That is, there are patients that in the whole body, as the urea increases, as the ischemia increases, as the vasodilatory metabolites increases, it affects the kidneys also. So there is the chances of happening of leading to hepatorenal syndrome. So in a patient of ALF, we also assess the kidney functions. Going on the investigations, the hepatitis A, the serological marker is IgM antibody to HAV. This is detectable around 5 to 10 days before the onset of symptoms and usually decreases to undetectable concentrations within 6 months after recovery. In neonates and young children, HAV RNA can be detected in stools for many months. Okay, then now for hepatitis B virus, this you guys know mostly, but I will just briefly discuss. In acute hepatitis B, there is a combination of positive HBs AG and IgM anti-HBC. This is the diagnostic of HBV infection. In chronic HBV, we know that there is going to be a positive total anti-HBC and negative IgM anti-HBC, and they have persistence of HBsAg antigen. What is important to know is that in the current day and age, we normally do anti-HBsAg screening. This happens in many recruitments across the country. It used to happen in the West, but when I was applying for King's College in Great Ormond Street, and at the first day we were asked to do anti-HBsAg sampling, and unfortunately for me the level was low, so we had to get booster shots. This is now being practiced a lot in India as well. In most of the hospitals at admission they do anti-HBsAg screening because they were required to administer booster shots if the level is low. Going on, you have got, just bear with me. One minute. Going on. Now we have got then in hepatitis C virus, it is important to know that the first detectable markers is viral RNA, which appears 1 to 2 weeks after the exposure. Then 7 to 8 weeks later, we have got anti-HCV IgG antibodies. HCV RNA is important in selection of treatment strategy also, and as the type of antiviral to be administered, therapy duration, all is on the basis of that. In this context, HCV genotyping is also important. HEV, in the acute infection, HEV RNA becomes undetectable in around 3 weeks. After the clinical symptoms appear, the virus continues to be shed in the stool for another 2 weeks after that. So again, but in this, the first immune response is anti-HEV IgM, which remains detectable for around 3 months. But again, we don't do a lot of antibody screening in these patients in HEV infections. Going on, the ultrasound is normally not routinely indicated up till unless some other feature like febrile icterus or anything else concomitant is there. Going on, so what is the treatment of acute hepatitis? This you guys already know. It is a supportive. There is importance of bed rest. We should take care of any symptoms like vomitings, and if the patient has fever, symptomatic treatment needs to be there. And what is most important is to monitor for danger and clinical signs. Going on to the specific drugs and the prevention, I think I've not mentioned the drugs, but I will quickly talk a little bit about antivirals. This will mostly be covered in the chronic hepatitis chapter, which I think Dr. Raghavendra will be taking. So you guys know that hepatitis B, the currently approved, there are around 5 to 6 drugs, which are they are like pegylated interferon alpha 2A. There are Yeah, so there are various nucleoside analogs like lamivudine, adafovir, entecavir, tenofovir. So all these drugs are there, which are nucleoside analogs. And you guys also know that we don't do a lamivudine monotherapy, and it's always a combination with the interferons to avoid the YMDD mutations. Similarly, for hepatitis C, we all know that as per the genotype, there are various drugs like which are like Peritavir, ritonavir, Tesabuvir, which are there. And normally in patients less than 12 years of age, we give a combination of pegylated interferon along with ribavirin, and then depending upon which genotype is there, an FDC combination of the specific antiviral is administered. So going on, we all also know now it is important for a public health perspective and for the MBBS graduate to know what are the various injectables which are there, and especially as you guys have seen that for COVID, the most important thing which we have in our armamentarium is the injection which we have against it. Similarly, for hepatitis A, hepatitis B, the most important thing which we have is the prevention by getting the infants injected by the appropriate agent. So starting with hepatitis A, it is essentially an inactivated vaccine which is licensed for use more than 1 year. As you guys know that there are 2 doses of HAV vaccine which are recommended, and they have a protective efficacy of 90 to 95% or more. The median predicted duration of HAV after 2 doses is actually 45 years. So what is recommended is that the second dose is to be administered 6 to 18 months after the first dose. Okay, and the importance is to achieve an anti-HAV IgG titers of more than 20 million unit per ml, and it is quite a safe vaccine. Local pain and swelling is all that is there. Recently, they've also launched a live attenuated vaccine from the H2 strain of the virus. This has been said a lot in KEM Pune, where they had seen that it provides a long-term efficacy protection. But it's important to know, in case there is an outbreak that is happening of HAV, there is a role of injectable HAV. There is not a role of the injectable means the inactivated vaccine HAV. There is no role of live attenuated vaccine in case of an active epidemic control and prevention. Going on, for hepatitis B, the dose is less than 18 years is 0.5 ml or 10 microgram. More than 18, as you guys can see, is 1 ml or 20 microgram. It is administered intramuscularly, and this, it's important to understand that it is routinely administered within the first day of life to all newborns. 3 doses are recommended in 6, 10, 14 schedule. Ideal minimum duration between the first and second dose is 4 weeks, and between the second and third dose is 8 weeks. For catch-up vaccination, the recommendation is 0-16 months. For MTCT, that is mother to child transmission, it is if the mother is hepatitis B surface antigen negative, the recommendation is that we give HBV immunization as per schedule, including the 0 dose. If the status is not known, in this particular case, the 0 dose is particularly important. If the mother is HBsAg positive, specifically if she is HBeAg positive, which means she has got a high infective load, and there is a very good chance that the hepatitis B virus would have been transmitted to the newborn. As you guys remember, these MTCT, HBV, HCV transmissions are what lead to chronic hepatitis carriers and cirrhotic livers. So in these particular patients, we should ensure that hepatitis B immunoglobulin along with HBV vaccine is administered through 2 separate injections at 2 separate sites within 12 hours of birth. Fine. And after that you give 2 more doses. So after giving this first dose, you give additional dose at 1 month and at 6 weeks and 6 months. So once, okay, so these, so after the birth dose and 1 month dose and 6 month dose are to be given. Suppose hepatitis B immunoglobulin is not available, then the HBV vaccine alone can be given at 0-1-2 months, and an additional dose can be given at 9 to 12 months. If we give immunoglobulin and HBV vaccine together, the protective efficacy to protect against an HBV infection is very high. It's around 85 to 90%. Okay. What is important to know is some special situations like preterm. So if you've got a preterm infant who has more than 2 kgs, you treat it like any normal healthy infant. For a child who is less than 2 kgs, if the mother is HBsAg negative, you give first dose at 13 days of age and dose 2 and 3 as per schedule for full-term infants. Fine. So this is when preterm HBsAg negative mothers. For HBsAg positive mothers, again we have to give HBIg, that is HB immunoglobulin and HBsAg vaccine within first 12 hours of life, and we continue the vaccine series with 3 more doses beginning at 4 to 6 weeks as per schedule for full-term infants. So we immunize with 4 doses as compared to 3 doses for a healthy infant as we were doing earlier. Fine. So that is the only change we have for preterm infants as compared to the full-term infants. Now we will go on to the acute liver failure. So we have got pediatric acute liver failure study group, which was established in the early 2000s. They give us a standard definition of ALF, that is that absence of a chronic disease, evidence of hepatic injury, prolonged prothrombin time or INR with more than 1.5 with concomitant encephalopathy, or INR more than 2 without encephalopathy, and these criteria should be fulfilled within 8 weeks from the onset of infants. There are various other classifications which are there, like there is a study group in Japan called the Intractable Hepatobiliary Study Group, which also gives ALF classification on the basis of prothrombin time, INR more than 1.4, 1.5, and severe liver damage within 8 weeks of onset of symptoms. Then going on, what is important for you guys is to know the O'Grady classification. This elaborates about something called as a fulminant hepatic failure. Fulminant hepatic failure is essentially that the patient goes on to develop CNS manifestations within a short period of the acute liver failure onset and within a short period of the symptoms onset. So from the point of symptom onset, the patient goes into acute fulminant hepatic failure, that is hyperacute FHF. From the point of symptom onset, then I mean symptom is from the first time the patient starts having manifestations, be it nausea, vomiting, fever. Within 8 to 28 days, the patient starts having features of CNS involvement, that is acute FHF. And within 1 month to 3 months, when the patient has features, that is subacute FHF. There are other entities also, like minimal hepatic encephalopathy or overt hepatic encephalopathy, which are by deficits of cognitive, psychiatric, and motor dysfunction in the individual. But those are more pertinent in adults and bigger kids, because in small kids we cannot appreciate these subtle manifestations. So going on, we go on to the pathophysiology. There are multiple mechanisms by which the acute liver failure occurs. The most common hypothesis is a Trojan horse hypothesis. What happens in this is that, as you guys know, that in the acute liver failure, there is a lot of ammonia production inside the intestines. There are a release of gasomediators like H2S and carbon monoxide locally in the which leads to splanchnic vasodilation and a distributive state. Also, what occurs is there is a lot of shunting that is happening, leading to because of the vasodilation, all the blood from the splanchnic circulation, it starts entering into the systemic circulation. So all the ammonia which is there, it starts, the blood ammonia level increases. Ammonia is a essentially a gas which can pass the blood-brain barrier into the astrocytes. As it enters the astrocytes, if you remember the lecture yesterday, we were discussing about the intracellular osmoles like glutamine, glutamate. So ammonia gets converted into glutamine in the astrocytes, and then it leads to an osmotic effect intracellularly, pulling the water from outside into it, thereby resulting in a astrocyte edema or resulting in features of increased ICP, which are important in acute liver failure manifestations. The other causes are overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria. This is because there exists abnormal the commensals decrease and the pathogenic bacteria increase in it, because often in these patients they're giving a lot of antibiotics. Often in these patients the gut motility is impaired. Also, there are other factors which stem from liver abnormalities like impaired glucose homeostasis, increased lactate production, impaired synthesis of coagulation factors, etc. And as we discussed earlier, there are a lot of bacterial and fungal infections which can occur. So after understanding what is causing the pathophysiology, we should understand there are certain conditions. So if there is a patient who has already come to us with FHF, or maybe has come to us with hepatic encephalopathy stage 1 and 2, there are certain conditions which can be coexistent in this patient, which can result in precipitating or rather pushing the patient over the edge. These include conditions like with increased nitrogen load, like GI bleeding, renal failure, blood transfusion. Then there can be metabolic conditions like hypovolemia, hypokalemia, alkalosis, hyponatremia, hypoglycemia. Then increased stresses on the body like bacterial peritonitis, UTIs, surgeries. Then right, and then administration of other hepatotoxic agents like ongoing isoniazid administration. All those things can result in precipitation of the hepatic encephalopathy. It is also important to know that you should know that the differentials. If a patient of acute hepatitis has encephalopathy, it might not necessarily be hepatic encephalopathy. There can be septic encephalopathy. There can be intake of drugs like opioids. There can be a concomitant CNS infection like with enteric. There can be hypoxemia or hypercapnia happening. There can be uremia which can be there. These are various causes of FHF. Ready, Rekna. You can clip the slide if you want to. As you can see, there are multiple causes which are there. So how do we go about it? We first of all, we need to do a physical examination. We need to search for what is the etiology. So we need to see for features of chronic liver disease, and specifically if there are any pointers like if this cataract, it will give you an idea that this patient might have galactosemia, it might have hydrogen tolerance, Wilson's disease. Then it is important to know the liver span, because in a chronic disease process the liver might actually shrunk because of the hepatocyte loss. Similarly, so when do we think if a patient has come to us with acute hepatitis and the mother asks or the relative asks, what is the chance that this patient will deteriorate? What are the subtle signs you can pick on? This is if the patient has got decreased oral acceptance, persistent vomiting, basically features of liver cell failure like deepening jaundice, a regression of liver span. If the patient has got features again of hypoalbuminemia like ascites, and obviously the patient has CNS manifestations. So these are subtle cues on your history examination which can give you an idea if this particular patient is going down. So how do you manage this case? As we had discussed, we do hematological tests, These include CBC with platelets. Did you do bleeding diastasis tests like PT, basically test for extrinsic pathway, intrinsic pathway, that is PT and APTT, common pathway test. If we can do, we should know what is the calcium level. We need to know if there are features, if there is any ongoing DIC. So D dimer, fibrinogen needs to be assessed. Then biochemical tests like serum sodium, as we know, hyponatremia is a bad prognostic factor. Potassium, as because hypokalemia can precipitate hepatic encephalopathy. Then the LFTs, which consists of the bilirubin, AST, ALT, ALP, GGT, total albumin, and serum globulin. And obviously, we need to assess blood gas with pH. We also see for the liver synthetic functions, that is ammonia. Nowadays, it's common practice in most of the centers across the world, including in King's College and in various places. We do a serial serum ammonia levels because, as we know, ammonia more than 100 is a bad prognostic practice, and we try to use extracorporeal means like doing CRRT, that is continuous renal replacement therapy, to scavenge this ammonia. So a lot of ammonia scavenging therapies are used. Then we need to find an etiology. There is an endless list of investigation depending on what it is. We had already discussed about the acute viral hepatitis. What are the serum antibodies which you can do? Then depending upon the cause. For example, if you have got HLH, that is hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, you can do a bone marrow aspiration, triglycerides, low NK cell activity. If you have got other things like toxicology screening can be sent. You can have galactosemia, then you can screen for urine form on glucose reducing substances, Galliput assays, and so on and so forth. Then you have got conditions like tyrosinemia, where urinary sectional acetone, PMS, all these things can be screened. So what do we do when we have a patient who presents to us with FHF? We see how, first of all, treat the patient as infective. So you need to protect yourself. You need to make sure that you are adequately donned, wearing gloves and masks. We make sure that the patient's ABC, airway breathing circulation, is maintained. We monitor the GCS of the child, and if the GCS is falling, we need to secure an airway. We often need an accessory NG tube to watch for internal GI bleeding. We need to secure adequate IV access if we need to give vasopressor supports, and often these patients have hypoglycemia, so a GIR of at least 6 mg per kg per minute needs to be maintained. Then we need to obviously check for frequent hypoglycemia. Normal starting fluids for these patients is 0.9% normal saline with 10% dextrose with added potassium as per serial values. And remember, it is all these patients are very high risk for transfer. If you are working in a PHC or in a rural area, so it is better to transfer these patients in hepatic encephalopathy stage 1 than waiting for them to go down to hepatic encephalopathy stage 3 and 4, because when they reach that stage, there's already a lot of increased ICP that has happened. A small bump on the road as they are going in an ambulance can lead to herniation potentially. So these patients should ideally be transferred, or rather transported, earlier on. Then what is the most important thing in these patients is serial monitoring for the vital signs, to maintain a hemodynamic stability, to monitor the oxygenation, again to make sure that the patient doesn't have ischemic hepatitis, and obviously serial neurological examinations in terms of GCS, that's a Glasgow Coma scale, or a modified AFCO scoring, AVPU in a small infant, and a serial pupillary assessment. As you guys know, the various kinds of staging of hepatitis we see for serial asterixis, which is essentially a negative myoclonus, or if you have got that, if you have to assess for deep tendon reflexes, and you have to assess for planters, and by doing that we can assess whether the patient is going on to advanced stages or not. Because in stage 3 and 4, the patient will have hyperreflexia, extensive reflexes, while in stage 4 you'll have areflexia. Stage 1 and 2 will normally have a normal reflexes. and as the patient progresses, the stage patient will go from stupor to coma. So it is important that continuous GCS monitoring is to be done. If you have got EEG, that will help you in identification of these features early. Going on, we normally maintain a GIR of 4 to 6. In this, remember, because there is ICP, so we have a CPP, that is a cerebral perfusion pressure, which is MAP minus ICP, that is mean arterial pressure minus intracranial pressure monitoring that needs to be done. If you have an ICP, that is grand. If you don't have it, then at least we need to maintain a adequate age appropriate MAP. Fine. We need to correct the electrolytes. We often add a PPI to this patient. IAP consensus statement 2007 recommends NAC to all patients of ALF. Fine. Then we administer lactulose. As you guys know, lactulose is essentially, it gets metabolized in the colon to lactic acid, which results in acidification of the gut lumen, and this results in the because of the ammonia which is produced, it gets converted to ammonium, and because of this excess H plus and the gut acidification, it also inhibits the ammoniogenic coliform bacteria, which in turn also reduces the ammonia production. Fine. Then rifaximin some people give because it's a non-absorbable antibiotic, and to decrease the gut microbial load it can help. And ammonia salvage by doing CRRT by whichever means, by it might be continuous venous diafiltration, continuous venous hemofiltration we can need to use. Then we need to manage coagulopathy because the synthetic function is impaired, so the body cannot produce its own coagulation factors. So they need to be replaced extrinsically, either FFP or cryo. But it's important to know as many number of antigens you expose the child, the harder it will be to get a transplant. So a balance has to be maintained. But if the patient is actively bleeding, yes, you don't have to wait for anything. You have to give the transfusions as necessary. What is important is to save the life first. Then antibiotics, there is no place for routine prophylaxis, but if needed, a GPC, GNR, that's gram-positive cocci, gram-negative broad cover, along with an antifungal might be needed. Then it is important to know that in these patients, gram-positive organisms like staph, strepto, we have already discussed. Then there is a disease-specific treatment which can be there. For example, if you've got acetaminophen poisoning, you can give NAC, which can be given orally or IV. So orally, you can give something like 140 mg per kg, followed by 70 mg per kg in 17 doses. Then conditions like infectious conditions like HSV, you guys can give acyclovir. Then metabolic conditions like neonatal hemochromatosis, there are certain centers like King's College used to give a cocktail which consists of selenium, prostaglandin, desferrioxamine, NAC. But again, most people do an exchange transfusion, after which they give an IVIG, but it depends upon what is the age of the child. Then conditions like hyperammonemia. So this is an easy condition because in this we can give a sodium benzoate, sodium phenyl acetate, L-arginine, and L-carbamoyl glutamate can be administered. So the outcome in these patients is unfortunately quite bad, with up to 50% mortality in a fulminant hepatic failure. The poor prognostic factors are if the bilirubin is high, if the PT is low, if the patient is in extremes of age, has got high arterial ammonia, has got a high WBC ALT, and has got a fast development of encephalopathy. And there are various criteria for liver transplantation. As you guys know, there is a King's College criteria whereby if in acetaminophen induced ALF, if the pH is less, then or if the patient has concomitant increased PT, increased creatinine, and encephalopathy. This is an acetaminophen ALF, and in non-acetaminophen ALF, prolonged prothrombin time or a prolonged prothrombin time with extremes of age, hyperbilirubinemia, FHF with non-A, non-B hepatitis. So these are essentially some criteria. Now I'm open to questions. If you guys have any, just bear with me. You guys want to ask anything? Okay, so if let me just ask in the polls.